Let's keep reading this author. In addition, Paul quotes texts from the Old Testament referring to Yahweh and applies them to the Holy Spirit, referencing Jeremiah 31, Hebrews, which is used in Hebrews. We also have a quote from, or a reference to Exodus 25, as well as Hebrews 9, Psalm 95, and Hebrews 3, and Isaiah 64 in 1 Corinthians 2:9. So basically, what the author is reminding us of, if we look at Hebrews, it's borrowing the terminology from Jeremiah. If we look at Hebrews in another place, it's borrowing terminology from Exodus. You look at Hebrews in a third place, it's borrowing terminology from the book of Psalms. And if we look at 1 Corinthians, Paul's borrowing terminology from the book of Isaiah. So the New Testament is purposely pulling in information from the Old Testament because we're working from the same source. God is the only God there is. And so any discussion on Jesus and the Holy Spirit is going to have to defer back to those primary sources of God as that identifying first cause or first deity or first source, creatorship and things like that. This author continues. How am I doing on time? Still got about 5 minutes left. This author continues. He also mentions that the Spirit, speaking of Paul, he also mentions that the Spirit pours divine love and grace on the believer in Romans 5, Romans 15, 2 Corinthians 6, Galatians 5, Philippians 2, and Colossians 1. And that he, the Holy Spirit, is the power from God in Romans 15. So again, we're talking about the identity of the Holy Spirit as is articulated by Paul himself. Paul knew that God was only one God. Paul is not going to start suddenly introducing this idea that Jesus is a second God and the Holy Spirit is a third God or something like that. Paul recognizes that there's one divine God, one deity called God, and yet this deity known as God, he's tripersonal in his complexity. It's hard to put your finger on, right? Paul's the one who chose the Greek word mysterion, right? From which we get our English word mystery. Paul's the one that introduces this idea that God is mystery, and yet God is transcendent, and yet he's close, he's personal. That's the tension that we have to hold. Jesus brings God to us up close and in our face, right? He's fond of saying, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father, and vice versa. I and the Father are one. I'm in the Father, and Father is in me, right? Introducing this very complex, maybe Greek concept of perichoresis and things like that. This which is a fancy Greek term that refers to A being inside of B and B being inside of A, et cetera, right? The like kind of this difficult concept of Jesus being in the Father and the Father being in Jesus. That's what I mean by perichoresis. But from Paul's perspective, God was transcendent. He's beyond our understanding, and yet at the same time, through the Messiah, God is personal. So we can't leave God being distant, and we can't only collapse God into being personal. He's both at the same time. He's transcendent and he's personal. And that's the tension that Paul is going to have to hold as a writer. This author continues, like the Father and the Son, the Spirit is eternal in the book of Hebrews. He's omniscient in 1 Corinthians, and he's called holy, being implied here that his holiness is that which belongs to God, and therefore not the kind of holiness which is derived from created beings or created things, right? We have to remember, God didn't only create living beings, but he also created elements. The universe is comprised of non-living elemental properties, right? Power and energy and heat and other types of basic what we might call physical properties that exist in the universe that are not defined as living things. So here's my example. Electricity. Electricity is not a living being. It's not a personal it's not a personal object. It has no personality at all that I'm aware of. And if it does, please write into me and explain to me how you have come to the conclusion that electricity is a living thing. But as far as I understand, electricity is not alive. Now, it has power. right? That's to be sure, right? If I plug my fingers in the socket, I'm going to be introduced to its power. But I'd rather not do that. However, it was created by God. It didn't just happen by chance. It didn't whip itself up into existence. It didn't think itself into existence. It didn't evolve on its own, right? According to Darwin. So electricity is a creation from God, or the force of electricity, or the source of electricity was created by God himself. And yet it's not a living thing. The Holy Spirit is not a creature that was created by God. We know that he's living, right? Unless you're of that denomination that he's not a living thing, then he's a construct. He's a thing. I'm saying he, because that's the way I think. It's a thing. It's an impersonal force, right? It's electricity. No,